Are people with high IQs more successful? Generally speaking, people who score higher on IQ tests will, on average, go on to do better in conventional measures of success in their life. But is it true? Intelligent quotient EQ tests, by scientific definition, measures a person's reasoning ability. How good are you at solving problems? It is designed to assess human intelligence. How much IQs are needed to succeed in life? How do I increase it? Or do I even need to care? Let's face it, we've all been curious about how smart we need to be in order to get to where we want to be faster. I'm one of them. So I did some research. Here's what I found. Jay Zagorski, author of a study on wealth and IQ and a research scientist at Ohio State University's Center for Human Resource Research, says people don't become rich because they are smart. He said your IQ has really no relationship to your wealth. Warren Buffett, one of the richest billionaires in the world, says that if you have an IQ over 130 you should sell the extra to someone else. Your IQ has to do with how wealthy you become. What are your views on this subject? There is some relationship, but not what most people would expect. People with low to very low IQs under 80 tend to be poor. Other than that, there is not much of a relationship between IQ and wealth. So a guy with 80 IQ can become rich and a guy with 150 can become rich as well. There is some correlation though, depending on type of business and type of investment career. Businesses and investments that involve high degrees of abstract reasoning tend to favor high IQ people. Successful stock market investors and successful founder or CEOs of IT companies tend to have high IQs. Most types of businesses, however, require average or just over average IQs. I never have had a conversation about IQs that mattered about anything important. Ability to reason is completely independent from choices to act and persistence to ignore failure and keep working towards a goal. Well, the last half of that is only partially true. You have to be smart enough to realize when a goal is actually not possible and it's time to make a different one. However, I do feel fairly confident in stating that the threshold where that would be an issue is probably quite low. Envisioning the futile attempt of a zombie reaching through a fence for something. All that being said, I think that reasoning ability can affect the time it takes to get things done, specifically things that require learning and reasoning skills, possibly making wealth take less time to achieve for someone smarter. But, just because a smarter person might learn something new faster, doesn't mean they will choose to act on it sooner. And even if they act on something sooner, the timing of the response from the market is independent still. So unless the choice to act are the same and the difference in learning is very drastic, I really don't see any significant wealth advantage in the big scheme. You could also probably draw an argument that excess intelligence can sometimes even retard success, because one fairly common attribute of highly intelligent people is procrastination resulting from overconfidence. This is a very common problem manifested among software developers. After they have understood a problem, they underestimate the time required to implement the solution. Since they can fit the solution in their head, usually in an abstract form, they don't admit that implementing it will take much longer than they anticipate. Thus, sometimes they will delay their execution thinking they can still meet a specific deadline. No, it's actually the opposite in my experience. If you aren't smart enough, then get a mentor who is. Hire people smarter than you. Find a mastermind group. Yes, being smarter is better. This has been shown repeatedly in study after study. But you can compensate with other skills: hustle, creativity, salesmanship, risk-taking. Maybe if you want to make a living off winning quiz shows. Yes, I think having a high IQ helps. No, I don't think it's a prerequisite for success. Your IQ isn't determined by your grades in school, how many answers to pop quiz questions you retain, or how big your vocabulary is. It measures problem solving, pattern recognition, and your ability to learn new things. Think about it, when you take an IQ test, does it ask you trivia questions about pop culture? No. I think this is where people confuse IQ with being able to win on Jeopardy for a month straight. A game show that tested IQ would give contestants problems they've never seen before, and measuring their ability to solve them while being timed. So, in life and in business, we look for patterns, solve problems and learn new things all the time. Will it help to be able to do those better than others? Yes. Can you hire someone to do this for you? Yes, and doing so is a good way to solve a problem. A fearless person with a low IQ will have more success than a person with a high IQ scared to do anything. Intelligence advantage is cancelled out by inherent laziness. If we are born smart, then we go through school taking the easy route. It teaches us that we don't have to work as hard. Meanwhile, the kid with average intelligence, that is equally ambitious, works his ass off. That teaches discipline and that you need to work for what you want. The two, hard work and intelligence, can combine into something great. However, it's a matter of first teaching ourselves to work hard first. Hard work outdoes intelligence any day of the week. Do you really think Stephen Hawking doesn't have a high IQ? People who boast about their height are losers too. Does that mean tall people aren't more likely to be in the NBA? Great point. Many studies have shown IQ becomes a stronger predictor of success the more complex a job becomes. Look at Floyd Mayweather. He can barely read and is worth $500 million. Just shows all you need is the right attitude. Lol, he said it ironically, I guess, because persons always said that he is the smartest man in the world with the highest IQ and stuff like that. The one by Dennis Waitley is true though. Two people I know come to mind anytime I hear high IQ. One is my cousin, one is an old friend who I no longer see, for good reason. For such smart guys, I've seen them do really dipshit things. And not be very successful. Oh, spoiler alert. They're both schizophrenic, not kidding. Intelligence is of paramount importance. I think there is no question about it. The only question is whether IQ tests represent this ability accordingly. As far as I know, these tests are not perfect, but we don't have anything better. Because of this imperfection, we can't simply compare two people with each other based on this, but rather we have to look at large groups. If we look at large groups, people with higher IQs tend to be no better off. I searched a bit on Amazon and found this book here. I haven't read it, but it looks like it's an up-to-date summary about the science behind IQ tests. For everybody who's interested, P.S. as for quoting billionaires in competitive sectors, I would be very careful. To survive and prosper in these areas, you sure as hell have to be very clever and astute. I will take common sense over a high IQ any day of the week. Of course, maybe that's why Forrest Gump is one of my favorites. Actually, you can change your IQ if you work hard enough. Either ways, IQ doesn't matter if you're a doer rather than dreamer. Play to your strengths. I'm sure you've all heard the quote about judging a fish by its ability to climb a tree. I would argue this is backwards. People that are poor tend to have lower IQ because of poverty. When you are constantly in survival mode, you have no time to stretch your abstract thinking muscle. The movie Trading Places comes to my mind. Eddie Murphy's character definitely became smarter throughout the movie. Exactly. Horses for courses. A very good friend of mine who has a doctorate in applied chemistry says that several of his esteemed colleagues would not know how to change a light bulb, and he was not kidding. We all have strengths and weaknesses we can play down or play to. Success comes from knowing these abilities or inabilities and leveraging them accordingly. I read recently that there is no correlation between income and IQ once an IQ exceeds 120. However, this interesting post debunks that theory. I'm not sure I'd be quick to agree that the two were directly related. There may be a loose correlation as far as some people becoming successful because they find the position where their thinking becomes their trade, But I've met some seemingly intellectual people living on the breadline who just can't or won't change their mindset to enable them to progress. I have friends who are book smart with multiple degrees and doctorates, not in themselves a measure of IQ, but you can agree that to understand the most technical sciences, you've got to have some brain power behind you, who are earning much less than I. And I've also worked with people who have had the highest of positions in a company, yet struggled with the concept of calculating a percentage, or grasping the logic of a cost proposal that has been put to them. Environment and DNA only determine where along the timeline you start. How far along it you travel is dependent on your determination and attitude. That's not to take anything away from people with lower incomes. Circumstances can break a person in a way that is all too easy to dismiss from an outside perspective. I believe that success is not limited by intellect or circumstance, although certain combinations of the both may lend themselves more favorably. There is a very good theory by Malcolm Gladwell, I think this was the interview but not sure, where he basically points out that although you need a high IQ to a certain extent, that is not the deciding factor. His approach sees it as one prerequisite, and once you are over the threshold, more doesn't make you more successful, greater than other factors take over. In his example, he takes two people that have or had higher IQ than Einstein. One of them succeeds as everyone would expect, while the other one spends his life working as a nightclub security guy. It's a very interesting approach, and in fact reminds me of Warren Buffett's speech in India, where he tells the graduates with the highest IQ, if you have above 130, shave off everything above that and give it to the guy next to you. You don't need it to do what I do. If you even look at Henry Ford and Thomas Edison, most of these guys didn't even spend 5 years in school and they are great entrepreneurs of their time. And if you look Richard Branson, well, his massively successful career speaks for itself. A high IQ obviously doesn't hurt, but it's likely not a very good indicator of success in entrepreneurship. This quote can also be used for IQ. And the beats high IQ if high IQ doesn't take action and has a shitty mindset. Guess what? 95% plus of all people are action fakers and have a bad mindset. I would bet all day long on a low IQ person that takes action and believes in himself over a random high IQ person. BTWA for a lot of people, because they tend to research everything to death before they take action. A lot of high IQ individuals also tend to be perfectionists. Those traits might be good for an employee but are counterintuitive for entrepreneurs. In my experience, people with lower IQs often tend to take more action and don't second-guess everything. This leads to more real-life experience that all the smart kids that don't dare to take action and risk failing can never learn in books. Also, don't forget the impact of belief, which is also independent from reasoning ability. Some of the sharpest minds in science fall into the trap of believing things not actually proven, and subsequently make life decisions founded on those beliefs, not always to their financial benefit. It can happen to anyone, in any walk of life, in any career field, with a belief in any topic. I went to school with one of those guys with a super high IQ. He has had a tough life feeding his need to continuously learn anything, drifting through a strange world alone. I pity him whenever I see him now, as he is considered the local madman. He is anything but mad, but just lacked direction and in turn could not channel his energy into the right mold. If you were to sum it up in one word, the common link between Ford, Edison and Branson is not IQ, it's persistence. That's true. Persistence is the key to me. IQ is important, but it's not the package. Put it into. Having a high IQ doesn't make you smart. You know what would make you smart? Building the first lightsaber. That's a pretty good idea. We would have to find out how the transmission of energy works, along with the process of storing it in a compact container. I know an exceptionally intelligent individual. He has a doctorate in mechanical engineering. He is also ruthlessly aggressive when it comes to doing stuff. Once he starts something, he won't stop until he's finished the job, no matter how long it takes or how horrendously difficult it might be. He is a seriously wealthy multimillionaire, Not because of his IQ. Most university professors aren't rich, but because of his mindset. It's the determination which makes all the difference. Imho. I also know a successful engineer. He was on the football team, but he was and still is a kind-hearted guy. However, he is still dominant. In fact, he can get anything he wants without asking for it, but he's not a taker either. That's very true, but it doesn't come easy, because behind the scenes, everyone goes hard 24/7. Great question, and luckily one with a definitive answer. There is a positive correlation between IQ, academic success and career success. However, having a high IQ with a lower level of emotional intelligence or the wrong family background can have a negative correlation, particularly regarding success out of school. The Lewis-Terman study of gifted children, which is still running today after some 80 years, has proven as much, but has also illuminated some interesting findings. Take a look at this article for more context. Malcolm Gladwell's pop psychology book Outliers asserts IQ to be somewhat meaningless, but that is objectively untrue. It's meaningless only in the right conditional context. Renowned Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker has gone to great lengths to prove as much, let alone the above Terman study. It's common sense, really. If you have supportive and talented parents, strong ambition and an aptitude for introspection and emotional sensitivity, then having a high IQ is Elon Musk is the classic example of what happens when super high IQ has the right conditions. None of this should be disparaging to someone who tests below 130, or even 100 for that matter. A positive relationship between IQ and success in no way denotes that lower IQ is a disadvantage, because the factors enabling a high IQ individual to succeed can have a profound effect on anyone. A person of reasonable intelligence with confidence, imagination and ambition will have just as much chance of success as anyone else. And that's the bottom line. It's also worth pointing out that in spite of the correlations drawn, there's plenty of reason to be dubious about IQ as a measure. Take Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning theoretical physicist, for example. His IQ was tested at a mere 125, yet he scored the highest in the US on the difficult Putnam mathematical competition exam by a large margin. He's renowned as a genius among the intellectual community. IQ can be something of an indicator, but ultimately all it does is test a person's in areas. Meaning, it doesn't mean someone is more likely to find the right answers, rather it's likely to make them better at justifying whatever beliefs they've been conditioned to have. The classic example of this is Chris Langin. If anyone's interested in what a Will Hunting level of intelligence looks like, look up MIT professor Terence Tao, whose IQ has been tested between 220 to 230. He's known as the Mozart of math, but I think we could all agree he'd be a terrible businessman and entrepreneur. It's funny that you mention Feynman because I was thinking of a physics analogy. Potential intelligence, as tested by IQ tests, can be likened to potential energy. The potential is there, but without the needed action or release, it goes nowhere. I shoot bow, and when the bow is fully drawn it has a certain amount of potential energy stored, but unless I loose that arrow, take action, nothing happens. That is why, I think, we see people who would be by most standardized tests, not very intelligent, making tons of money and enjoying a ton of success. The reason? They took action and that potential was unleashed. Of course, with a high IQ maybe you have a tendency to overthink things. Just some thoughts of mine, because I assume if you know those things you must be curious about this stuff. You might want to look at this study on the difference between verbally and mathematically precocious youth. Basically it found that children with high math ability didn't necessarily have high verbal ability. Kids with high verbal, however, were more likely to have high math. If you take a look at this article you will see the suggestion that Feynman may have just been given a verbally loaded IQ test as a child. If you take a look at Terence Tao's SAT scores at 8 years old, he scored a 760 math and 290 verbal. Just for comparison to the above mentioned study, He would be an example of extreme math ability and general intelligence not necessarily showing up on verbal tests. Just my theory, but I feel Ek would play a bigger part.